Back in 1958, when Israel was just 10 years old, the American novelist Leon Uris wrote Exodus, a novel about Israel's founding. Shockingly, it went on to become an international phenomenon. It ranked second only to Gone with the Wind as a bestseller, and it remained first in the New York Times bestseller list 3/4 of a year after its publication. The novel was then made into an Otto Preminger film, starring the A-list celebrity actor Paul Newman as its hero, Ari Ben-Canaan. Readers of this book and viewers of this film took note of something strange about its hero. As a blonde, blue-eyed man of culture and Western graces, he didn't actually look like the Israelis he was meant to represent. He looked American. And that was part of the point of Exodus. In portraying Israelis as racially white, Western in their sensibilities, and as smitten by the novel's non-Jewish love interest, the very American Kitty Fremont, the novel's author was making it easier for most Americans to associate with Israel, its struggle for existence, its cause. Those people over there, the novel seemed to be saying, those people like Ari Ben-Canaan, they're like me. My guest today is Mati Friedman, frequent podcast guest and contributor to Mosaic. In the context of Israel's last confrontation with Hamas, Mati came to an interesting recognition about the American public opinion and Israel. For whereas Leon Uris advanced as a representative Israeli, a mythological person with distinctly Western sensibilities, in order to attract Americans to Israel. The very same mythology is now advanced by those who wish to distance Americans from Israel. Then, Israel's friends thought that the nation was full of white, rugged frontiersmen patriots. Today, Israel's enemies think that the nation is full of white, rugged frontiersmen patriots. The same mythology, equally as inaccurate then as it is now, persists in a world whose moral sensibilities have undergone a fundamental reversal. Welcome to the Tikva podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. Mati Friedman described the persistence of this myth alongside the fundamental change in American moral sensibilities in an essay called Israel's Problems Are Not Like America's in The Atlantic. One more thing before we begin. It's something we really didn't delve into, but it's very important. Americans now tend to see ourselves and the world through a racial lens, and that distorts what we see. Mati's point is to explain this to us, so that we can see in the reflection of Israel a more accurate picture of our own mind. But Mati's not the only one who sees all of this. So do the adversaries of Israel and of America. The leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, gave an interview to Vice News that was posted on YouTube on June 4th, 2021. In it, speaking to this English-language outlet with a substantial left-leaning American audience, the Hamas leader says, in response to a question about Israel's military tactics, quote, "I want to take this opportunity to remember the racist murder of George Floyd. George Floyd," Sinwar went on to explain, "was killed as a result of a racist ideology held by some people. The type of racism that killed George Floyd is being used by Israel against the Palestinians." Now that is a chilling illustration of Mati's point. The conflicts between Israel, a majority of whose citizens hail from North Africa and the Middle East, and the Palestinians, is not anything remotely like the racial conflict plaguing the United States. But a great many Americans are now committed to seeing all social phenomena through this lens. And here you have the leader of Hamas exploiting this racializing prejudice to propagandize back to elite Americans what they want to hear. Sort of like Leon Uris was. Well, if you enjoyed this conversation, you can subscribe to the Tikva podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. I hope you'll leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback to this or any of our other podcast episodes. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikva, you can visit our website, tikvafund.org, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Here now is my discussion with Mati Friedman. Mati Friedman, welcome back to the Tikva podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Recently, in the confrontation between Hamas and Israel, a great many analysts were thinking about how to restore deterrence, how to address the humanitarian dilemmas which are introduced by that kind of conflict, how to save Israeli civilians, marveling at the technology of Israel's anti-missile shields. But you were driven back to read Leon Uris. Matti, what were you doing?
Well, I must admit that I was reading Leon Uris even before the war broke out, because I've been thinking about the very strange ways that outsiders perceive this country. I've been here for 26 years, I guess, since I was 17. And because I write in English, I'm on the fence between the reality of Israel and the way people perceive it from the outside. And it's a very rich vein, because there's such a huge gap between what people are imagining and the real place, whether the fantasies are positive or negative. And I thought that one way to look at it would be to go back to one of the most powerful fantasies about Israel in post-World War II America, which is the book Exodus. Famous as a book, a best-selling book, and of course famous as a movie starring Paul Newman. I saw the birth of the American fantasy about Israel in the first years of the country's existence. Leon Uris, who's a Jewish American novelist, World War II vet, comes to Israel and produces this very, very effective book about the rebirth of the Jewish nation after the Holocaust. And there are very detailed sections on the Holocaust, sections which would have been new to many readers at the time. This is the 50s, so people still haven't really realized what happened in Europe. And the book is dominated by the character of Ari Ben Canaan, who's this supposedly a kibbutznik pioneer, but who's very clearly an American archetype. He's blonde. He knows how to dance, which of course no self-respecting kibbutznik in the 50s would have done, because that kind of dancing, like the foxtrot, that was considered bourgeois. And those values were condemned, and he knew good cognac, and of course he knew his way around a rifle, and he was kind of a frontier character. And his love interest is Kitty, who's an American nurse who's not Jewish, and she kind of gets caught up in the events of the War of Independence, and she's presented also as an American archetype, in every way. And the book ends with them together, which upon rereading the book seemed to me like the point of the book. Like the book, in my rereading of it as an adult, I'd originally read it as a teenager, and going back to it as an adult, it's pretty clear to me that it's a fantasy about America. And the point of the book is to have this new Jew who's so different from, the Jewish caricatures that had preceded Exodus. Here's a Jew who can win the heart of Kitty, who's the idealized non-Jewish American woman. So there's a lot going on in Exodus, and most of it has absolutely nothing to do with Israel. And what was interesting about that fantasy, the Ari Ben Canaan fantasy of Israelis as kind of blonde frontier pioneers, is that if you look at the current fantasy that's really kind of gaining ground on the left or the West, you see that the negative fantasy about Israel is that Israelis are white and they're settler colonialists, and the fantasy is that Israel is Ari Ben Canaan. So the fantasy is the same fantasy in a very interesting way, except now Ari Ben Canaan is a racist. Now being what Ari Ben Canaan is, or what Paul Newman was in the movie version, that's bad. That represents everything we hate. And the fantasy has been flipped in a very interesting way. It's still a fantasy. The positive fantasy was nonsense, and the negative fantasy is nonsense. But what's interesting about them is that they're actually recognizably the same fantasy, which you can see in Exodus.
That's so interesting. We should unpack that. Just to go back to the original motivations of the fantasy and what it did for the U.S.-Israel relationship. There's no evidence, I don't think, that one can derive from the text or interpret in the text that the inaccuracies of presenting, Joe Israeli in Ari Ben Canaan are in order to consciously mislead Americans. To the contrary, the author is trying to create a positive, praiseworthy, heroic image of Israelis.
Absolutely. What the author is trying to do is to get Americans to love Israelis by imagining Israelis as a kind of American. And I think he realized the real country that he saw in the early 50s when Leon Uris was here was going to strike people in America as so strange that they would not be able to identify with it in any way. So if we take Israel in the early 50s, most of the Jews here are newcomers from the Islamic world, Jews who'd been, driven out of Morocco or had left Morocco, Tunisia, Kurdistan, people who did not seem like Americans in any way. Those were the majority of Israeli Jews in the 1950s. So as I wrote in the essay for The Atlantic, if he was looking for a representative Israeli character, he could have chosen the Arabic-speaking seamstress from the Jewish ghetto in Marrakesh. But that obviously wasn't going to fly for what he was trying to do, which was to to create a hero that people would love. And that was part of a broader attempt by Israelis and by American Jews to present Israelis as a kind of American, to kind of get Americans on board with this new country by suggesting that we here in Israel were actually a kind of American. And I can read you another interesting example of that, which I didn't have space to put it in the essay, but there's a very interesting memoir of the 1948 war by a writer named Daniel Spicehandler. The memoir is called Let My Right Hand Wither. This is an American. He'd been in the Second World War and then fought in the War of Independence. And he's writing for an American audience. And I'll just read you a few short sentences that appear at the beginning of the book. He's talking about the Israeli War of Independence. The American reader, I am sure, he writes, will notice the close resemblance of the youth of Israel to his own youth. The former GI will be amazed to see how closely the Palmachnik resembles him in the last war. And the scene of Palestine and later Israel as a frontier country will remind Americans of the struggle America once had in its fight for independence. So there you have an attempt to really present what's going on in this tiny Jewish enclave in the Middle East as something that Americans would recognize, even though anyone who knows anything about the Palmach, which was the pre-state militia here, they were not like GIs. They were radical socialists. It was chaotic, and they had nothing but disdain for the capitalist West. They were part of the workers' revolution, and they idealized the Red Army and Tito's partisans. And what happened here in 1948 actually had nothing to do with 1776. But there was an attempt to suggest that here was a place that Americans could identify with, not because it was just a worthy project in its own right, but because it was similar to America in some kind of essential way.
The ethnic division that you rightly suggest, of course, that permeated Israeli cultures, perhaps one should say, in the earliest years of the state. It is understandable how Americans could see this image of Ashkenazi Jews who dress in Western attire and so on, because, of course, the leadership class of the Mapai party looked an awful lot like that.
Well, if you've ever seen a picture of the Mapai leaders, they didn't look like Paul Newman. They looked more like Groucho Marx. So they were, heroic figures in my opinion. They were, the saviors of the Jewish people. And I'm more and more in awe of them as time goes on. But to say that they were white and blonde is very misleading. I mean, these were people who had been in Eastern Europe and had been condemned as swarthy Orientals and, hook-nosed foreigners for centuries. And part of what the Zionist movement wanted to do, consciously or subconsciously, was become white Europeans. They wanted their kids to be blonde and strong. They rejected the caricature of the Jew as it was portrayed in Europe. And in some ways, I think they accepted the caricature of the Jew as it was portrayed in Europe, which is interesting. Anti-Semitism always kind of gets into the heads of the Jews, and they come to believe it in some way. And I think that's true of the Zionist movement. If you look at the early propaganda posters from the JNF, and you'll see blonde pioneers plowing the field. And that was never the country. It was just the country's dream about itself. And it made sense politically to project that dream. And it seems to have worked. For a couple of generations, Americans really identify with Israelis. Politically, that makes sense. If I'm a political leader in Israel, those portrayals make a lot of sense, but I'm a journalist. So it's my job, in my opinion, to portray the society as realistically as possible so that people can actually understand it, whether it's politically wise or not.
It seems to be your assessment that in the early years, that image of a European frontiersman, reading poetry in the morning with a rifle over his shoulder, that was a kind of propaganda, but a kind of perhaps effective propaganda that, at least in the American context, worked.
Right. I mean, it was aspirational. That was the image of what we were striving for, and it was very effective in molding, a national character out of these disparate groups that were scarred, people who were basically refugees, even though sometimes they didn't like to call themselves refugees. And they were given a very powerful story about themselves, and that's the secret weapon of Zionism. Zionism doesn't tell people to feel sorry for themselves. It doesn't tell people that they are refugees, unlike other national movements that are, close to us in physical proximity. Zionism rejects the idea that we're victims and tells people that they're actors. So you're not a refugee, you're a pioneer. And you're not homeless, but you've come home. And that's all wrapped up in this figure of the kibbutz pioneer. And it's a very powerful figure. And it was never an accurate representation of the society, but it was an effective idea, both externally, as we've mentioned, and internally, as the Zionist movement went about forging a society against pretty long odds.
So the main argument of your piece is that you trace a gigantic transformation and an enduring continuity. The enduring continuity is that the image of Israel in the minds of some subset of Americans is the same image. To caricature it, a European blonde newcomer to the land. What's changed is that whereas in previous generations, in the generation that was Leon Uris's immediate audience of readers, that image was meant to endear Israel to the United States. Now that very same image repels or repulses Israel from the United States. Do you have any idea what happened?
I mean, first of all, I guess it depends which part of the United States you're talking about, because it certainly is not the ideal image for a big part of the liberal United States and the liberal West in general, because it's true, of countries like Britain and France as well. On the more right-leaning side of the spectrum, I think those attributes are still appreciated. And some people on the right imagine, Israelis as kind of gun-wielding frontiersmen, and they like that. And it's not true either way, but not everyone hates it. But I think that there's a huge change that happens in the 60s, maybe. People, after the Second World War, people are enamored with power. You're supposed to, be powerful. You're supposed to wield power. It's the America of John Wayne and Hemingway and the manly man. And that begins to change in the 60s, where people in the West become disgusted with themselves and the way they've become too powerful. And the Vietnam War ends up being kind of a catalyst for this change. And the soldiers come back from Vietnam not celebrated as people who risked their lives for America, but condemned as baby killers. The mood really changes on the left in the 60s, just as Israel becomes powerful. Israel really kind of enters into its powerful phase in 1967 with the victory in the Six-Day War, just as power goes out of fashion. And the one of the first powers to recognize this change and the way it can be exploited is the Soviet Union, which is involved in the Middle East, in kind of Cold War politics in the Middle East on the side of the Arab world, and starts promoting propaganda that portrays Israel as imperialism. Zionism is imperialism. Zionism is racism. Zionism is apartheid. This all starts very early. It's circulating in the 70s. It's circulating in, kind of hard left academic circles in the West, where it gestates, a generation, maybe a bit more, and then really explodes. And you're seeing it now. And so for people on the West who, reject nationalism, who reject power, they increasingly see Israel as the symbol of those things that they hate.
There's a secondary argument maybe we should pursue, which you've just alluded to, which is that if you are a right-of-center American who still thinks that power is essential and that nations serve a purpose, and that you're not completely instinctively grossed out by the idea of owning a gun, then when you look at Israel, you'll see all these 20-year-old soldiers riding the bus with guns. You'll have an impression of that country that reinforces your priors and shows you everything that you already love about the world realized in that place over there. If you're a left-of-center admirer of Israel, you likewise have, the Pride Parade in Jerusalem, universal health care, and any number of your priors confirmed by the Jewish state. Maybe you could just talk about how the projection that you diagnose in the article actually admits to further refinement. There are multiple projections of America that are reinforced by looking at Israel.
Sure, it depends what you're looking for. And when you encounter observers in this place, you notice that most of the international observers here are just looking for some kind of reflection of themselves or some kind of ammunition that serves whatever ideological war they're waging back home. And I learned to distinguish journalists between geologists and miners. If you want to be a geologist, you have to study for a long time. You really have to know what you're talking about. And you're going to come to a piece of ground, and you're going to study it, and you're going to come up with some really complicated and contradictory information that very few people are going to understand. That's geology. But if you're looking for gold, then you don't have to know very much, and you could just start digging. And when you find gold, you know it, and you take it home. Most observers fall in the second category. So if you're looking to prove that Israel is, liberal utopia with, gay rights and women's rights, and you'll find proof of that here. It's certainly true. You'll go to Tel Aviv and you'll see that this is a very liberal country, in many ways much more liberal than the United States. And on the other hand, if you're looking for proof that Israel is a fascist, gun wielding, ethno-nationalist hellscape, you'll also find find that. The country is a very complicated place. I think like any country, I don't think it's necessarily more complicated than most countries. It's just that the scrutiny is much more intense here. But people will find what they're looking for because all of the trends exist here. Just let's look at the past month. We had ethnic violence in our cities, in the mixed cities, and there were riots in which Jews attacked Arabs and Arabs attacked Jews, and synagogues were burned in the city of Lod and elsewhere, and that would indicate a society that's in terrible shape in terms of ethnic relations. This week, we have a government being formed for the first time with the support of not just an Arab Israeli party, but the Islamic movement in Israel is part of the government. This has never happened before. And the leader of the party called the Ra'am, which represents the Islamic movement, is someone who's seeking integration and wants to wield political power in Israel for the good of his constituents. So what's the trend? Well, there's more than one trend. So, we have to appreciate that this is a complicated place with a lot of contradictory things going on at once.
In terms of Israel's relationships let's just focus on the U.S.-Israel relationship. The U.S.-Israel relationship clearly has got to operate at multiple levels at once. It needs to operate at a military-to-military level and a government-to-government level. But Israel has always been wise in welcoming popular American democratic engagement with the idea of the country and the real country, inviting Americans to visit, etc. That seems to be very wise. Now, just thinking politically and diplomatically, is Israel served by revealing its full self, or is it served by emphasizing aspects of itself for American viewers, American onlookers, American visitors?
Well, these are questions that are really questions for people who are engaged in diplomacy or messaging. I'm a journalist, so I do see it as my job to try to offer the most accurate reflection of the place that I can, which is often ugly. I've written books about parts of this country that are not necessarily the ones that anyone in the government would want to emphasize. And I also think that if we present a realistic picture of ourselves, the country comes off pretty well. I think Israel's done an admirable job of, maintaining itself in a very rough part of the world, not without making grave moral and strategic errors, of course. But I don't think we have anything to hide or can hide really anything. That's just not the kind of place it is. It's not, communist China. Everything that goes on here is known, and that's the way the society is. There are no secrets here. That's why sometimes you see this society portrayed as kind of a society that keeps secrets. And I mean, that's ridiculous. Every Israeli knows everything all the time, and you can't keep anything secret here. So I don't think we could lock off parts of our national identity, even if we tried. Certainly when the people who do diplomacy or public messaging think about what parts of the country they want to play up, sure. They're going to have to think about what works for which different part of the public. And I think that we're entering a stage in America and in the West where things are getting very binary. That liberal middle ground where Israel always operated, that bipartisan zone where the country always wanted to be is, I don't know if it's gone, but it's definitely going. We're going to have to present different things to different sides of the spectrum, and Israel's going to have to decide where it wants to invest its capital. Parts of the political spectrum are probably lost to Israel. I don't think there's much point in begging, the hard left to, support a country that they've convinced themselves is, an apartheid fascist state that needs to be destroyed. So I think we should just forget it and concentrate on the many, many people who would like to support Israel. What are those people's values? What do they identify with now? What is it about this country that they could identify with? I think a lot of people like the idea of a nation. And I think a lot of people, are worried about the breakdown of the nation and the family and the disappearance of religion and the disappearance of social cohesion. Well, Israel has all of those things. So, it's possible that we, should spotlight the Pride Parade in Tel Aviv. I think it's great that we have one. By the way, we just had one in Jerusalem this week, which is also great. There's a culture war that's happening in the West, and Israel's caught up in it, whether we like it or not. And I hope that there are people smart enough in our government to try to figure out how that can best be used to Israel's advantage.
Of course, Israel has the advantage when it presents these different faces of itself. It is presenting multiple true faces of parts of Israel that are real. As we've said, if you wanted to find a liberal utopia in Israel, you could find a version of that. And that is no less real than the traditional culture of religious sensibility and strong nation and intact family life that is also just as real and present in Israel.
It's all here. And I think it's important to present a complicated picture, in part because I think when you present a utopian picture to kids, for example, let's just think about American Jewish kids who are growing up in day schools and going to summer camp and getting a very simplified, kind of idealized version of Israel. And then a lot of those kids, meet reality in college or, after college and are kind of shocked that this isn't the country that they sang about at summer camp. And then I've seen some of those people flip 180 degrees and from one Ari Ben Canaan fantasy, they'll go and buy the other dark Ari Ben Canaan fantasy instead of, growing up and realizing that the world is complicated. So I think it's important to present a complicated picture. I think we have a lot to be proud of. And, any country is going to have a backyard that's ugly. And Israel's flaws are magnified 1,000 times by the level of scrutiny. We're subject to scrutiny that no other country gets. As I often like to point out, when I was a correspondent for the Associated Press, this was between 2006 and 2011, we had 40 full-time news staffers covering this place, which was more than the AP had in China by a pretty wide margin. Here, there are about 12, 13 million people, Israelis and Palestinians. And in China, there are 1.3 billion. And we hit more people here, and that's pretty standard. So the country is just analyzed to such an extent that people are being convinced that, it's the most important country in the world, that the conflict here is the worst in the world, that Israel's flaws are, unprecedented and unique in some way. But that's an illusion, and it's a poisonous illusion. And we all need to kind of get back to the firm ground of reality as soon as possible.
So the last really big thing that I want to discuss, Mati, is the leitmotif that runs throughout your examination, but of course also runs throughout the politics as they are currently configured in the United States. The lens through which the political left sees Israel has become a racial lens. Can you just talk about what that illuminates and what it distorts?
Well, it illuminates the obsessions of the liberal elite in America. It doesn't illuminate anything about the state of Israel. As I mentioned in the essay in The Atlantic, it really popped up on my radar for the first time about 15 years ago when I was at the AP. And there was a road in Israel where there were a number of deadly shooting attacks carried out by Palestinians at Road 443, if you're familiar with it, from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And a few Israeli motorists were killed on the road, and the Israeli army shut the road to Palestinian cars, leaving it open to cars with Israeli plates, which means Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. If you had an Israeli plate, you could be on the road. And one of my colleagues at the AP, who was an American who hadn't been in the country for very long, asked if we could now refer to this road as segregated. And I was really struck by that because I've always tried to judge this place on its own terms. And here was an American clearly bringing, an immense amount of American baggage into this country. And I became aware of it then, and I've seen it, many, many times since then. And it's reached really a fever pitch right now where you have people in Congress saying, what they're doing to us in Ferguson is what they're doing to us in Palestine, which is bizarre because there is, of course, a very large power imbalance among Israelis and Palestinians. Israel is much more powerful than the Palestinians, but the position of 6 million Israeli Jews in the broader Arab world is not the position of white people in America, right? There's 6 million Jews here. There are 300 million Arabs, of whom, a small number are Palestinian. If you zoom out even farther, we're in the Islamic world. That's 1.5 billion people, depending, who you ask. Some people say more. And there are 6 million Jews in one corner of it. That's not white people and Black people in America. And we're facing an attempt to destroy the state. Coming from the Arab world, Hamas is pretty honest about it, right? Their goal is not civil rights in Israel. Their goal is to build a caliphate on the ruins of Israel, and they're admirably honest about it. So the idea that these two situations have anything to do with each other is ludicrous. But what it is that American tendency to project America onto everything. So if you're looking at Iraq, to give you I think maybe what might be the prime example, 20 years ago, people started imagining that Iraq was a kind of America in waiting, that there was a dictator named Saddam Hussein who was preventing Iraq from becoming another America. So the thing that needed to be done was to take out Saddam Hussein and allow Iraq to become a democracy. And the results of that decision were, the decision to invade Iraq were catastrophic because, of course, that was a complete misreading of Iraq, and similar misreadings replay themselves in places like Libya and Egypt with catastrophic consequences in some cases for the people, for the real people who have to deal with the fallout. So I think it's very important to understand that the world is not America, but these situations are completely different and need to be understood on their own terms.
Israel's Problems Are Not Like America's was published in The Atlantic by Mati Friedman on May 24th, 2021. Mati, thank you for joining us.
Thank you again.